Hi crafty friends, in today's episode of my Big Fat Pink Journal, I'm going to be showing you how I make these vintage style envelopes. I think they look relatively authentic and are such a great add to a vintage style journal. These are also great for a mass make, so you can make quite a few and have them ready to add to your journals as you go. They're pretty quick and very fun to make. You'll need to start obviously with some envelopes. I'm using white envelopes. I find these best for this vintage style as I'm going to coffee stain mine, and the coffee stain will look best on white. Of course, you could use handmade envelopes too if you've made those already with coffee stained or tea stained paper, and of course you don't have to make them vintage. So mine have been coffee stained and dried, and I have ironed them. I generally hate ironing, but paper I'll iron any day of the week. Just a little tip, when you're coffee staining envelopes, make sure you dry them open. Otherwise, when there's wetness on the seal section of the envelope at the top, it will obviously dry closed and that seal will become secure and you won't be able to open your envelope. I'm just going to tear this one open. This is normally how I open envelopes anyway, and I will use this in a forthcoming project, but not for today's demonstration. I'm going to work on these three. Now, they already look pretty vintage with the color of the coffee stain, but I want to add a little bit more. There's a few different ways that you can add elements to make it look like it's more aged and it has foxing. For the first one, I'm going to use some liquid distress ink. I'm going to add some to my waterproof surface and then put some water. I want to water it down a little bit. I don't want it too concentrated. And then using a small paintbrush, I'm just going to splash a little bit on the envelope and then also spray with some water to help and dilute a little bit of those splashes so they look a bit more faded. While I still have that watery ink on my desk, I'm going to take one of the other envelopes and just press a couple of the sides into the inky puddle and then also spray with water just to help and pull the ink away from the edges and dilute it a little bit more. For the third one, I'm going to use ink pad and a blending brush. And I'm just going to blend a little bit on the edges, just distressing that, but not all the way around. I feel then it'll be a little bit too much. And then of course the first two are quite wet, so I'm going to dry those. Now we need to address the envelopes. This will make them more authentic. Of course, you can make this information up. I like to use a fake name generator on Google. It spits out a name, a surname, and an address. Super easy. And then using a black fine liner pen, I'm going to write that onto the envelope using some cursive handwriting. But of course, any handwriting goes. I actually made a similar video quite a few years ago, so this is a bit more of a refresher. What I did learn though, that somebody put in the comments, which was extremely helpful, is that I'm not going to add a postal code, as these are meant to be vintage, and postal codes only came out in the 60s, depending on which country you're in. But if you want something really vintage, say from like the early 1900s or even earlier than that, just leave out the postal code. I learned something new that day. You also can leave the address and name off totally and just have a vintage looking envelope. It can hold ephemera, stickers, or anything fun in your journal. Don't feel that it has to be labeled and addressed. Next step is to add some stamps, as if these really were posted. Now, I don't have a whole lot of stamps from just one country, so I've picked out a few of the more muted colored stamps, and they're from all over the world. So it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be specific or accurate. I just need 2 or 3 stamps per envelope. You can put more or less. To age these, I'm also adding a bit of distress ink. They're quite white on the edges and they don't really blend in with the vintage look. So I'm just trying to tone those down a little bit. And I'm going to stick these down with glue. They don't have the sticky back anymore, and glue will hold better long term. If you don't have stamps for this part of the project, that's also okay. You can cut out little pictures from a magazine or an old book, roughly the size of a small stamp, and stick those in the corner. You can also leave the stamps out altogether. And then I also have a few little by airmail stickers that I want to use. And how I'm going to age those is I'm going to just crumple them up in my hand, and then I'm going to use a nail file and just file roughly over it, just here and there. And then where the little creases are from my crumpling, it's going to wear away. It's going to look worn and used. Again, this part is optional. I now want to also add a postmark stamp. I feel this will make it look even more authentic. If you don't have this, you can obviously leave it out, but if you do, it's a little fun extra bit. And I'm using black permanent ink for this. I'm doing a quick test as I don't want it too dark. It's meant to be faded. I'm stamping just once per envelope, sort of half on the envelope and half on one of the stamps. I then also have a round stamp with some writing on. I can't really make out what it says, but it looks like part of that postmark stamp, so I'm going to add that too, one per envelope. And that first one is too dark. I don't like it. I'm going to try and water it down, but the ink is permanent and it's dried, so now it just looks a little bit not so great. Thinking I could maybe cover it up with another stamp, sort of start again in that corner, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I don't like it, I'm going to fix it. Going to age the new stamp a little bit again, and then just stick it on top. It'll cover most of that dark stamp that I don't like. Another way to make it look aged and rough up the edges is by using an open scissors and just scraping along the edge. These envelopes are made of a thinner paper, so it's a bit more fragile, so be a bit gentle, but this creates great aging. I took a paintbrush just to try and wet the ink that I had just put, and then you'll notice on the bottom envelope a big drop of water fell into the middle of the writing. At first I panicked and thought, oh, I had ruined it, because it actually was my favorite out of all the envelopes I had made. But then I thought, once it was dry, that it actually looks great. It's part of the vintage process. It could have got caught in the rain. And it has smudged the writing a little bit, but I think it all adds to the vintage charm. It wasn't a total disaster. Accidents happen, work with it. I tried this envelope on quite a few of the pages in my journal. It looked best on this pink with white spots background. And before I stick it in, I'm just going to distress the inner part of the envelope flap, as this part is going to be visible when you open the envelope, because I'm going to stick it onto the page. I was going to use glue stick to stick this down, and then changed my mind and used double-sided tape. We need it a little bit more secure, as it is sort of a working element in the journal and we will be opening and closing it a little bit. We want it to be more secure. So I'm sticking the flap of the envelope down onto the page, and the envelope will open sideways. There's easy access to inside the envelope to add ephemera or an old letter. We can fill that in a later project. I'm adding a few small pieces of the vintage tape, so it looks as if this tape is what is holding it in place. I really hope you enjoyed this video and demonstration on how to create your own vintage style envelopes with name and address and postmark. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell so you're notified every time I upload new content. This video is part of a series called My Big Fat Pink Journal, and a video drops every week on a Tuesday at 11 p.m. Melbourne time. Thanks again for watching. Happy creating, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.